Bill Cipher is a fascinating character. He was a villain who was chaotic, who was insane for the sake of being insane, doing bad things because, well, they were bad. And that is not something I usually insist is a good trait in a villain. In fact, many times I've denoted that's what makes a bad villain, but for Bill Cipher specifically, I actually think it makes one of the most fascinating ones. But why is that? Well, let's talk about it.
Oh, Gravity Falls, it is good to be back! Name's Bill Cipher, and I take it you're some kind of living ventriloquist dummy?
When we first meet Bill Cipher, he is incomprehensible. He is this strange creature who has appeared out of nowhere, and none of us expected it. Dipper watches from the sidelines as this strange entity is summoned into the world using backwards text, which actually literally meant backwards text.
Backwards message.
But the point is, as he appears, he totally, incredibly, just warps reality itself. We have no clue what he is. The ominous secrecy of who he is what creates the intrigue. When trying to create a villain who is just that insane or crazy, the ominous secrecy is what you want to lean into. You want to find a way of causing the intrigue of who they are to be more than the confusion as to why they are this crazy. You want people to wonder what's going on with them. Why are they like this? You don't want them to just immediately go, oh, they're crazy. But ask the question of why. Because Bill was a creature summoned from this plane of alternate existence, we are immediately curious as to what he is about. That intrigue is settled. See, here's the deal. When you create a villain who just does bad things for bad things, they're flat, one-dimensional, pun intended. But for the sake of Bill Cipher, it is different because he had something no other villains typically do. He literally lived on a different plane of existence with different rules, with different ideals, with different abilities, and so we were capable of having a character who was insane, who was crazy, who was all the typical things that just make a boring villain, but we were able to empathize and understand with it because we knew he was just from somewhere else. Think about it this way. We as humans live in 3 dimensions. We have up, down, left, right, horizontal, vertical, you know, the whole shebang. However, if we were to be transported into a world of 2 dimensions, well, frankly, it would just be very strange. We wouldn't probably care a lot about it because they're just stick figures everywhere. They're not that important. We would consider them not necessarily us.
Come, look at this 2-dimensional bird's nest.
Ooh, me first. I'll just step past Leela here.
Ow!
Halt!
Who said that? All I see are a bunch of vertical line segments.
And so when we look at Bill Cipher and understand that he's coming from a totally different plane of existence to ours, we understand that he just looks at things differently than us. He just doesn't see us as important. He just wants to have fun with his new 3-dimensional body. And so that's what happens. He is a totally alien creature who is just trying to have fun. So if you want to have your mustache-twirlingly evil villain, find a reason for that to legitimately make sense. And honestly, having this creature from beyond coming down mixes eldritch horror with that sort of aspect, and I think it creates one of the most fascinating villains.
We'll meet again, don't know where, don't know when. Oh, I know we'll meet again some sunny day.
And so as we continue to learn more about Bill Cipher, we learn more rules about him which makes sense. See, yes, he is ultimately powerful and mustachely twirlingly evil, but he has rules that he has to abide by, making him even more of a fascinating character. Because yes, beforehand, he was just a creature who caused crazy things to happen. But now there is a way of interacting with him that doesn't make him immediately always the most powerful person in the room, but always with the potential of being so, making him an incredible threat while still not making it impossible to have him in the story regularly. You don't have to write yourself into a corner when he appears, but there is a threat of him very much existing. And that, again, creates a wonderfully fascinating villain. So we've talked about how you can have that stereotypically evil villain and also how to have an ultimately powerful villain without it being something that writes you into a corner. But let's talk about how to utilize such a villain. Over the course of time, Bill slowly gains more and more power. He is working within the rules that he is governed by in order to break out of them, which makes him a looming threat constantly. That is something very important to do. If you're creating a villain that's meant to threaten the main characters of your story, you're going to want such a character to be able to remain looming in the background, even with the rules in front of them. If the rules are too rigid and cannot be worked within by the villain's always going to remain a less than important and not very threatening factor, which is not what you want when creating this type of character. So you have to have loopholes. Typically, when you create the rules, you have to understand where the loopholes are going to come from. In the case of Bill Cipher, he managed to control and manipulate other characters to get specific ones to make the deals and wishes necessary to break him free. He was able to possess a character who earlier in the story was shown to be a little bit ditzy and stupid, which therefore made sense that he would be able to enter their weak mind in order to convince one of the main characters to make a wish that would break him free. That is exactly the kind of thing that you want to do when creating these sorts of characters. You need to have the loopholes already in place. It's especially difficult in interactive stories like D&D, where you're trying to get the players to work within those rules in order to have the threat be looming, which means typically you're not going to want to involve the characters a ton. Just have them know about these things that are happening in the background and give them the chance to potentially try and stop it. But that being said, once Bill was free, the rules were broken and suddenly he was incredibly powerful, unstoppably so. Which is why there was a failsafe put in place. The writers already knew that he would be unstoppable, so they had been hinting up to this point that there would be a way of trapping Bill once again in the prophecy. They had constantly hinted at this, and that is something that you can do to make these things more manageable. You can have the villain hint at these things by, for example, having Bill Cipher constantly call Dipper Pine Tree, which would eventually be revealed to be the symbol that he was supposed to represent in order to seal Bill Cipher away.
You're awfully persistent, Pine Tree. Hats off to you!
You need to have a system in place that is going to be able to seal the enemy away if they fully gain their power. That way, there is a way to come back from the darkest hour. However, if you've watched the series, you know that didn't end up working on Bill, and instead it was just the determination of a few characters who managed to do so. Understand that if you're creating an ultimately powerful character, you do have to give them certain weaknesses outside of just their power. For Bill, it was, well, frankly, his arrogance. He assumed there was no way that they could outsmart him, and so he fell for their trap. That is something easily that you can do. When you've created an ultimately powerful character, don't let them get out of every situation simply because they're ultimately powerful. Even if you have all the power in the world, there is a way of tricking you, and if that happens, many times people will panic, which leads to mistakes, and it's okay to allow that to happen so long as it makes sense for the story. Ultimately, Bill Cipher is one of my favorite villains of all time. He is a very strange creature, and he was a perfect example of all the things I typically avoid putting in a villain. But for him, because he was so alien, so strange, it made perfect sense to have him in the story in the way that it was, and it broke all the rules in the best kinds of ways. I would really recommend when creating a villain to understand their motivations. Even if they are doing things that we as humans would not, you can still find ways of making it make sense for that character if you play it out correctly. If you want to see some more character analysis breakdowns, I got some right here. Go into the world, make it your own.